There's a phrase that sounds like a compliment, but has quietly wrecked more relationships than most guys will ever realize. You're such a safe option. The problem is, most of the time, that phrase doesn't mean what he thinks it does. A lot of men believe they're building the perfect relationship when, without even noticing, they've become so predictable that they stop being seen as someone who could actually be lost. And the crazy part? Most guys only figure that out after she's already gone. In this video, you're going to find out what it really means to be called a safe option, why so many men end up stuck in that position, and how one simple mindset shift can completely change the way you're perceived. Topic 1. The truth behind being called a safe option. A lot of men think being called a safe option is a huge compliment. I mean, who wouldn't want to be seen as reliable, stable, and dependable? But there's a massive difference between being respected and being seen as the guy who's always just there. That difference flies under the radar for most people. And when it finally shows up, it usually comes with a sentence nobody wants to hear. You're amazing. But what makes this situation so frustrating is that the guy rarely did anything obviously wrong. Quite the opposite. He answered every text, showed up when she needed him, dodged unnecessary drama, and did everything he could to prove he'd make a great partner. From where he was standing, the logic made perfect sense. If showing up demonstrates value, then showing up more should build a deeper connection. Except relationships don't always follow the logic that makes sense inside our heads. There's an uncomfortable truth that not many people have the guts to say out loud. Being a reliable person is a strength, but coming across as completely predictable can shift the way someone sees you. When a woman feels like there's zero chance of ever losing that guy, she stops seeing his presence as something worth holding on to. And that's exactly how, without anyone noticing, a lot of men end up in a position that's way harder to get out of than they ever imagined. Topic 2. How good men accidentally become predictable. The funny thing is, no guy wakes up one morning thinking, "Today I'm going to make myself completely predictable." It happens gradually, through small choices that look like affection on the surface, but end up sending a totally different message. He always texts back first. He reshuffles his schedule to fit into hers. He almost never says no. At first, those things seem like they're strengthening the connection. Over time, though, they stop being seen as gestures of value and start being taken for granted. Picture two guys. One of them drops everything the second she calls. The other is also genuinely interested, but he doesn't abandon his own goals just to be available around the clock. Ironically, the second guy usually comes across as far more emotionally secure. That's because emotionally mature people understand that someone with his own life doesn't need to constantly prove how much he cares. Value isn't about being available all the time. It's about being consistent over time. That's where a lot of guys mix up being kind with being self-sacrificing. Being a good man was never the problem. The problem starts when he believes he has to earn love by giving up who he is. Little by little, his hobbies disappear, his priorities shift, and he even keeps his opinions to himself just to avoid any friction. Without realizing it, he goes from being an interesting person to just being predictable. And right when he thinks he's doing everything right, an unexpected moment puts all of that to the test. Topic 3. The moment she chose excitement over security. In the days that followed, he tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe he'd been too focused on work. Maybe he hadn't been attentive enough. Or maybe, somehow, he'd been too attentive. His mind kept replaying every conversation, every hangout, every message he'd ever sent. Like someone rewatching the same movie over and over, hoping to catch a scene they missed the first time. Then he found out she was seeing someone else. Someone who, at least on the surface, seemed to offer far less stability, but sparked a completely different kind of feeling in her. That's when something shifted inside him. For the first time, the question stopped being, "What does she want?" and became, "Who did I turn into while I was trying to please her?" That shift in perspective seems small, but it usually marks the beginning of something much bigger. Instead of looking for answers in her choices, he started looking at his own. Realizing he'd poured so much energy into winning someone over that, without noticing, he'd stopped investing in himself. And it would be exactly that discovery that would completely change the way he was seen from that point forward. If this video has already made you see something about relationships and personal growth that you never noticed before, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Every week we share real insights and strategies to help men build confidence, emotional intelligence, and self-respect. No games, no manipulation. Now here's why this story started to turn around completely. Topic 4. The shift that had nothing to do with dating. Contrary to what most people would expect, the real change didn't start when he decided to win her back. It started the day he accepted a hard truth. For a long time, his happiness had been way too dependent on someone else's approval. That realization stung, but it also brought an unexpected sense of freedom. For the first time in a long while, he stopped asking what he needed to do to be chosen, and started asking what kind of man he actually wanted to be, regardless of who was standing next to him. The changes came quietly, barely noticeable at first. He got back into working out consistently, not to impress anyone, but because he wanted to rebuild the discipline he'd let slip away. He started putting more focus into his career, picked up hobbies he'd dropped, and invested more time in friendships he'd been putting on the back burner. Books like Atomic Habits by James Clear and The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey helped him restructure his routine. But the biggest transformation happened inside his own head. Slowly, he stopped living for texts and validation and started building a life that actually made sense on its own terms. The most interesting part? Nobody notices a real change just from physical appearance or external achievements. People notice when someone carries themselves with calm, when they stop acting out of neediness and start making choices from a place of security. He no longer accepted every situation out of fear of ending up alone, and he didn't feel the need to constantly prove his worth to anyone. Without even trying, his posture, the way he spoke, even his silence started communicating something completely different. And it would be exactly that new presence, built far from her eyes, that would eventually spark a reaction neither of them saw coming. Topic 5. Why confidence looks completely different from availability. There's a misconception that keeps a lot of men stuck in the same cycle, believing that always being available is a sign of confidence. In reality, confidence and availability are two totally different things. A confident man can absolutely show interest, affection, and commitment, but his whole world doesn't revolve around someone else. He has goals, responsibilities, and an identity that existed long before the relationship did. That difference might seem subtle, but it completely changes how he's perceived. Think about a guy who cancels his own plans every time there's a chance to hang out with a woman. Now compare that to another guy who also enjoys her company, but keeps his commitments because he respects his own word. Neither one is being cold or playing games. The difference is that the first one is quietly communicating, without meaning to, that his priorities shift based on however much attention he's getting. The second one radiates emotional stability. Emotionally secure people don't need to prove their value at every turn, because they know that healthy relationships happen when two complete lives walk side by side, not when one life starts revolving entirely around the other. That's exactly what started happening with him. Without playing games, without disappearing on purpose, without following some manipulation playbook, his presence naturally changed. Conversations got lighter because he was no longer talking out of fear of losing her. His decisions got firmer because he stopped negotiating away his own limits. And, almost ironically, That's exactly when she started noticing something she'd looked past before. The guy who had once seemed like just a safe bet now carried something far rarer. The quiet confidence of someone who knows their own worth without having to announce it. And that shift was about to produce an outcome neither of them expected. Topic 6. Why she finally saw his value. Months later, their paths crossed again. It wasn't some movie scene or a carefully staged moment. It happened simply, almost by accident. But just a few minutes into the conversation, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. The man standing in front of her was still kind, respectful, and thoughtful. But there was a difference that was impossible to ignore. He no longer seemed like someone waiting to be chosen. He carried the ease of a person who was fully at peace with his own life, regardless of who decided to be a part of it. The most interesting thing was that he wasn't trying to impress her. He didn't bring up his wins, didn't go out of his way to show how much he'd grown, and never once mentioned the past. His confidence showed up precisely in the absence of that need to prove anything. Where every conversation before had felt weighed down by the fear of losing the connection, now there was just lightness. He asked questions because he genuinely wanted to talk, not because he was fishing for approval. And that shift in energy tends to be far more noticeable than any change in looks or bank account. That's when she started seeing what she'd overlooked before. Not because he'd become a different person, but because he'd finally gotten back the parts of himself he'd kept buried for so long. The independence, the boundaries, the calm, the self-respect. They made her realize the value that had always been there, but was once overshadowed by a constant need to please. Only this time, there was one key difference. While she was starting to reconsider the past, he was no longer making decisions out of fear of losing her. And that's exactly the point where a lot of men make a mistake that can unravel everything they worked so hard to build. Topic 7. Don't make her regret your goal. There's one detail that separates a real transformation from a change driven purely by ego. A lot of men, after growing, leveling up, and rebuilding their confidence, start waiting for the moment she finally regrets letting them go. It feels like a fair payoff after all that pain. But here's the thing, whoever is still living for that moment is still stuck in the past. Real freedom only shows up when her validation stops being something he needs to feel whole. Maybe she really did have regrets. Maybe she realized too late that she'd mistaken stability for a lack of spark. Or maybe that answer never comes. And at this point, it doesn't even matter. The biggest win was never making her look back. It was being able to move forward without carrying the weight of needing to prove something to someone who didn't see his value when it counted. At the end of the day, men who build their lives around purpose, self-respect, and personal growth stop being just a safe option. They become men who choose their own path, instead of waiting around to be chosen. Conclusion. When it's all said and done, the biggest lesson from this story isn't about making someone regret losing you. It's about never handing control of your own happiness over to someone else again. When a man builds real purpose, discipline, and self-respect, he stops trying to convince the world of his worth. And ironically, that's exactly when the world starts seeing him in a completely different light. Here's something worth sitting with, honestly. Have there been moments in your life when you were treated like the safe option while you were putting your dreams, your limits, or even your own identity on the back burner? What was the biggest lesson that experience taught you? Drop your answer in the comments. It might be exactly what another man going through the same thing right now needs to hear. If you're into content that goes deeper than surface-level advice and actually digs into male psychology, relationships, self-confidence, and personal growth in a real, practical way, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss what's coming next, and you'll keep building a mindset that gets sharper, more self-aware, and more independent over time. Because the real goal was never to be chosen by someone. It's to build a life so solid that you also get to do the choosing.